Hi, everybody in NANOG land. I'm thrilled and honored to give a talk at this NANOG 80. First, I'll give a little bit of background on myself. My name is Avi Friedman. I started not quite in the dawn of networking like some NANOG folks, but in 1992, I started an internet provider coming from education and not finding a way to buy dial-up access. Got into the internetworking space, was fascinated with that. Went to work at AboveNet as engineering lead at the global backbone and hosting company. Got really fascinated by Akamai, which was, as someone said, the world's largest non-network at the time. After Akamai, was CTO of a cloud company, also running infrastructure on the side, and saw a lot of gaps in the industry around analytics and where things were going with telemetry, and started Kentic to resolve that. I'm thrilled to be talking to everyone here today. I wanted to share my thoughts about what's great, what some of our challenges are in terms of our industry, how we're perceived, ways that we can improve, things that are coming down the pike, and I hope it is helpful to people, and I will take questions at the end. So first, before I get into the meat of it, I just want to say we all know what a difficult year it's been this year, but I think there's been an increasing awareness of how critical the NANOG community and internetworking in general is, and I'd like to thank you. I know that as I talk to people, the prominence of networking and of internetworking has really gone up over the last few years. Hopefully next year and beyond will be much calmer, but we'll continue to make the digital world go. So where are we in the world today? As I said, people are realizing that if Zoom doesn't work, if the network doesn't work, if people can't be connected, then business can't go, and even education and life can't go. That's good. Applications that people are using are increasingly the glue that connects people, and they run on networks. Bandwidth is going up and up, and we were very fortunate, thank you everybody, that we started the year over provisioned, and so far the supply chain has been holding, and the internet has been growing with maybe the number of micro outages that you would expect. And as one of my friends says, networks are the water of the clouds, or without the network, there is no cloud. And networking has gotten more complex. There's underlay and overlay and tunnels and 20 different ways of connecting things. But ultimately, someone needs to understand all the parts and actually make it all work. Connectivity is exploding. There's a lot of hype around this, but there's also a lot of reality. Just the diversity of interconnection is growing, as well as the importance. And there's more layers, more things to debug, more interrelationships, and in some sense, fewer people being, we think of being born growing, that understand all the different layers. And as folks that are on the operational side or have peers that understand, there's a lot of hair on fire. People are on the front line. There's issues with the network. There's issues everywhere, and competing projects. And again, it can often be a thankless job, but it's an important one. So what's the outsider view? We see ourselves, we come together I've been to dozens of NANOGs. We have the hallway track, we share information, we evolve technology. The outsider view in some sense is networking's going away. This is all virtual. It's API calls. It's I make a request, things come into play, and I hear the vendors talking about self-driving networks isn't, what is it that you folks actually do? And I think that we as a community both have a little bit of a marketing problem, and I think that as infrastructure sophistication grows and application sophistication grows, the operational teams will get more sophisticated and actually start working together more closely and try to have greater understanding. I think that will help with some of the outsider view, but I also think that we as a community could be doing a better job speaking a little bit less in jargon and trying to help build bridges to other operational groups. a quick review about where we've been, and this is a little biased towards my background and that of a lot of folks that I know in NANOG and RIPE and similar communities. A lot of us started as hobbyists, people that were going to use computers no matter what, got really interested in connectivity and connections from other areas of either hobby or professional computer IT involvement. And one of the things that's been great that I still see culturally in hundreds of networks that I work with is if you're willing to get out there on the front line and do work, if you have bright, shiny eyes, people will recognize that, and there's a ton of opportunity. What is great, but also a challenge, is that what you need to run modern networks is a little bit of a mix of what we'd call book knowledge, things you can get online, classes, and tribal knowledge, apprenticeship with a little bit of breaking things. And how to replicate the tribal knowledge and how to replicate breaking things without breaking an increasingly critical digital infrastructure, the network underneath. Those are things that I think we need to think about and work on a little bit. I have this meme here. It is known from Game of Thrones. There is a little bit of that, and I'd like to see us figure out as a community how we can break out of that. Don't use AS 7007. Don't use route redistribution. Things that are known, read the release notes before you decide whether you want to install an operating system. Things you don't get from book knowledge, but things that we know and communicate to each other. Whether it's in a job or, as I said, in a NANOG or other conference hallway track where people are teaching each other and exchanging tips. Especially in a COVID and increasingly remote world, this is something that we need to work on. One thing I think is really amazing is that you often get to reason from first principles, and you often need to, because we find bugs. Your average SRE is not going to find a kernel bug in an average year, and your average network practitioner will find a bug. I think that's really great, but it does require a certain mindset, and it requires that we lay these things out. What are those first principles, especially in a more complex environment? And so from the outside, it can seem simple, but the reality, and not even really getting into the politics of interconnection, can be more complex. Although the politics of interconnection is another area where there are a lot of things that are known that are hard to pick up for people that want to get into our industry. So the big question I have is, how do we scale this? And I've got some thoughts on this later in the talk. So I think of it as the greatness and the challenges that we have, or the angst and the awe, or the awe and the angst. And what's the awe? Well, when people in Uber drivers ask me what I do, I say, I make the internet go. My company powers the people that make the internet go. And people go, oh, that's really nice. Now, can you help me with my driver app? And I have to explain, that's not what it's about. But I really appreciate, I think a lot of our friends, coworkers, and families really appreciate what we do at a high level. But I'd also like to celebrate that we actually run probably the largest distributed system out there. We can have a debate with Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and others, but in some sense, we've got a distributed computing system that connects the world, and I think that's pretty amazing. It is very resilient. I am more amazed that it works as well as it does in some ways than that we do have failures. And there's a pretty cool article by The Atlantic that I encourage you to see and take a look at if you're curious for a more artistic take on our industry. So what are some of the challenges that offset the awe and the joy of what we do? Well, I mentioned in some ways there are silos and segmentations in operation groups across companies, and networking can often be a different silo. And that becomes a problem because we've got different tools and knowledge than other groups. And I think that this is a challenge that other groups are aware of too, and we and they can be working at over the next years to help bring these things together as applications are provisioning network, and network needs to be application aware. Another challenge is a lot of us come from a world where we understand these first principles, but there is a lot of evolution, and we can do a lot without really understanding some of the things that sit on top of the network. And some of that is in terms of cloud. And I've seen a lot of this siloing where you've got different groups that deal with different parts of the infrastructure. But one of the points that I'd like to make in this talk is that cloud is something that we need to be aware of. And the other is around telemetry. It's something that I focus on professionally now, but we've got some gaps in having a taxonomy, teaching people, having consistent ways of getting it, having consistent ways of dealing with it, and understanding generally what we do with telemetry to make infrastructure go. Another is with automation. This is both a hype thing and something that we've all done since the 90s, and it's something that we're all actively working on now. And this is a little bit of a challenge in that people on the outside, sometimes even inside our own companies, don't realize that automation does not mean simplicity, especially in terms of operation when we actually need to make all this go. Buzz and hype. I believe that there's a ton of wasted time that could be spent in forward motion in our industry, and that we should try to at least make sure that separate from the architecture, we actually have a curated space of plain speak. An example I'll give you is 5 or 6 years ago, when I was trying to understand what is all this fabric networking in each vendor. And it was clear to me, even though I understood the principles of all the things that it could possibly be, that it was going to take me many meetings with multiple vendors to figure it out. And I talked with a friend of mine, and he said, this is this, and this is that, and this is that in one sentence, and I understood. This happens over and over again, that I think we get in the way of teaching by not having a parallel path versus the hype. And this is something that we've been talking and thinking about before 2020, but is even increased in sensitivity, is really getting a more diverse community. And there are some communities like the peering community that maybe are a little bit more diverse than the engineering and architecture community. But even so, there's a long way to go to match even early career levels of diversity. And I think related to one of the challenges is, how do we attract the next generations? And a world is very logical. How do we get people who are really interested in making it all work and seeing the engines of the networking turn and building, operating, debugging, and scaling? So, mandatory meme. Why is it the network? Is it the network? How do these groups come together? How do we explain our value, and how do we grow? Those are things that I think about a lot. So where are we going? What's going on? What are we hearing about? Well, cloud, as I mentioned, in some sense, there's a lot of cloud washing. People think that there's to the extent that people think there's nothing underneath the cloud. But on the other hand, it is a critical part of how people are deploying workloads, and something that networking and internetworking needs to become even more familiar with, especially as we think about telemetry, analytics, monitoring. Automation, which is something that, as I said, in many ways, networkers have been ahead of, but the buzz and hype cycle has really led many people to think they're behind, when in fact this is a journey that we're all on. Streaming telemetry, there's a lot of energy around this, which is great, but also a lot of hype about what the current state is, and a lot of work that we still have to do. ML AI related to automation, related to telemetry. The network engineers can go home. The network is going to be self-driving. It's automatically learning things. I'll talk a little bit about what I think the truth is here. And the bringing it all together, self-driving, closed-loop networks, great aspiration, but this is not where we are today, despite some of the marketing that we see. So my take on the reality, automation is real, but really being focused on specific kinds of networks, use cases, workflows, and I think that's awesome. But sometimes the noise can get in the way of us making progress on this. And I would love to see more sharing of the success stories here. There was a great tutorial about turn-up automation at NANOG. I'd love to see more of that. more sharing of our journey on automation. AI ML definitely has applications, can definitely be unleashed on network data, network telemetry, network topology, configs, the entire breadth of our world, and can actually drive into automation. But there's no one that I've seen that has this self-driving network with the network automatically adapting and learning. And even basic things like take streaming telemetry, put it in a data lake, and magically get the observations out is bleeding edge. And again, I'd love to see some talks about the challenges that people are still having there, and sharing around that. Cloud is real, and I think sometimes we get cynical about people that think that there is no network under cloud, but it is something that I've seen a broad need for education about, and it is all knowable. All the things underneath it are things which we as a community are already familiar with, but if we're really going to help with end-to-end debugging for our customers, whether they're internal or external, I think that this is something that we need to do a little bit more with education and translation about. Just as networkers have issues sometimes explaining their world, I think cloud people do too, and would love to see a bridge. And so streaming telemetry, as I mentioned, I think it's awesome. We have a lot of customers that are using it. It is something that we unify with SNMP and correlate with other sources. But there's a promise that it is the only thing that you need. And what we've seen is that's not the case. I think there's a lot of evolution. There's a lot in the NANOG community. Sometimes we think about the world as 4 leading vendors, and the real world that I see is a little bit more complex. And I think that we need to bring the benefits of streaming and additional kinds of telemetry and open config and find a way to unify that with a more diverse technological world that's out there, and also talk about what we're actually doing today. There are a lot of use cases that I think are part of the hype cycle, and would love to see continued education around that. What do we do after we take streaming telemetry and capture it, and what use cases are we bringing out of that? So I will get to some things that I think about that we can do as a community, as individuals. But first, I'll give you my take on where I think we are going and processing the hype. First, absolutely, telemetry and AI are already helping. Even though we don't have complete closed-loop self-driving networks, I work with hundreds of networks that have major parts of automation, telemetry impacting things, AI, bringing the insights that do even some closed-loop functions. I do think specific operational patterns will be automated. I don't think we're going to see every single kind of thing that is a service being completely automated. And I think it's critical that we understand how to communicate, document those patterns. That's a gap that I've seen where, as I said, automation does not mean simplicity. Russ White told me that, and I don't know whether that's his original quote or not, but we as the reasoners from first principles will still have to make all that go. But I expect to continue to see, and am seeing in my customers, things like scaling up infrastructure, doing CDN load balancing, of course, DDoS defense, provisioning, but the entire loop of everything out to robots maintaining hardware still works in progress. I do think that security and operational tooling would converge. I do think orchestration as part of automation is going to drive that, because if the security folks don't know what's being orchestrated, they're going to waste a lot of time. And if the operations folks don't know what's being shut down or suspicious, then they're going to waste time investigating outages. This is not the culture we're in today, but I do think that it is the situation will improve. I do also think that operations groups will come together. I think we have some responsibility, but also the other groups do. It's something that I focus a lot of time on, is how does network feed APM and more general DevOps systems, and how do we do the reverse? There's a lot of application data as we think about telemetry that can shine a great light on network. For example, most switches and routers can't really give us performance data, but the data that runs right on top, the telemetry from that, combined with network data, can be very useful. Public clouds, the growth of public clouds will definitely outpace some of the data center WAN and even in some sense SD-WAN as the cloud providers get into that. But our world will still grow. That's why I think it's important that we educate, maybe even with some NANOG tutorials about that. So to wind up, I've got some, I'll say, calls to action. These are really things that I think about and I'm happy to try to get involved in. For the industry, one of the things that I think about is how do we attract new people? That won't alone solve diversity problems, but I think it'll help a lot to get new people in. And if we can be welcoming enough, ideally in a way that is more representative of especially early in career graduating folks, which are more diverse than our current community. So first, I think one of my challenges since I've gotten into the industry is that for an outsider, we sometimes use overly complex and I'll say IETF-ish terms. Not that I have anything against RFCs, and I think being precise is awesome. But in terms of helping people understand what we do, I think we have a way to go. And one thing I would point to is I don't even think we as an industry, for example, in automation or telemetry, have a clear set of understanding about what different kinds of telemetry, what different kinds of automation are. And I think it hinders people understanding and getting into our world. Similarly, cut the hype, and I will try to do this in my own activities and company, but I do think it holds us back both internally, inside the networking community, and externally. Education, and this is something that I've done some of and am trying to ramp up to do even more of. I think that can help with these things. And really, as we think about our own operations, how can we work better with other groups? Internally educating inside our organizations and thinking about the tooling coming together. So how do we get there? First, as individuals, we make up the community. I will just share that it's been hugely rewarding for me to take the things that I see that are confusing and try to break them down. It helps me gain understanding. And even though I didn't start off in the 90s to do that for, I would say, evil or career goals, it has been super helpful to me in my career and super helpful to a number of people that I know who followed this similar journey. One observation I'll share about that is if people learn something from you, they will always think that you are smarter and more accomplished than they are, even if that was never really the case in the first place. So there's definitely doing well by doing good. As companies also, people know and appreciate companies that do foundational education. And I'll call out an adjacent company, Cloudflare, who's got a Cloudflare Learning Center, doing great education about infrastructure. It's something that I am trying to put a lot of focus on as well. And then as an industry, I do have some suggestions, and I say this as someone that has not spent a lot of time on industry leadership. But as an observer, I look at, for example, some of the things that RIPE does, which is very definitely chartered differently than we are in North America with our organizations, and have been really impressed. But I think about, how can we help break down the walls, do the education, and my suggestions are panels. I think there's been some great panels, especially around diversity, around some of the trends over time, and I'd love to see more of that. Tutorials, it's something that used to be even heavier, really basic foundational tutorials, and would love to see and help with that. And I think that this is something, again, I've seen from RIPE and in analogs and other kinds of operational industries. Maybe some curation. How can we come together to curate some things that are out there and make them findable, but linked from NANOG and other organizations where people go for specific topics and of a specific interest, like internetworking. So for practitioners, who of course we all make up the communities, my specific advice, recommendations, and the things that I'm thinking about are automation. I think we do a fair bit of basically robotic process automation in Python without sharing. But I think learning APIs absolutely useful, and then thinking about how to make the use of those reusable patterns within your companies, and even how we share those. Cloudification, it's something that I've been paying a lot of attention to, which is just understanding the internetworking or the underlay network is not really enough for the kinds of workflows and insights that people need to drive modern operations. And I would love to see more foundational training, and we'll even volunteer to do some of that at NANOG and other groups to break down and explain the terminology and the internetworking methods and the intra-networking methods used in cloud for us who get involved in the end-to-end debugging. And then my call to action is documenting, teaching, and mentoring. The industry has been very strong at this. I can think of dozens of people that have done a great job, but the more we do, and I would say not only the senior people, some of the best content that I've seen is from people that are first learning, because if you can call out those things that are confusing, they wind up being helpful even to people that have been doing it for quite some time. So those are my thoughts on where we are, the awesomeness of getting to do what we do, some of the challenges of working across companies and industries, cutting through the hype, some thoughts that I have and ways that I will try to get involved and be helping as things evolve. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Well, very good. We now have a few minutes for Q&A. And there's been a lot of chat, a lot of Q&A into the chat. First question is, there was a comment about network engineers being replaced by shell scripts. And also the fact that layer 8 is hard. Avi, the question for you is, do you think that we need to develop people's skills? Is that something that's important?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason we're not going to be replaced by shell scripts is because as we automate the things that that are repeatable, that are abstractable, we still need people that hold how everything works in their head, both for design and architecture, and also for when things don't work right. Because, as I said, in the keynote, we do have more than your average kernel developer set of bugs in the networking world, and that's to be expected just given the pace we're moving at and the diversity of technologies that we have. Yeah, and regarding the second point that came up on chat, that was really a riff on the question of how we codify some of the information that we know and find out from apprenticeship, which is effectively a lot of what's driven our careers, and also from the hallway track at NANOG, where we hear and learn, and people educate us when we're coming up. And that also is something which can't really be encoded. The people glue that actually makes internetworking work, I don't think that's going away, and that's something that we need NANOG and other organizations to continue driving.
Okay. Well, very good, Avi. We thank you very much for joining us today. If anybody has any additional questions for Avi, please do that in chat.
Thanks, Augie, and thanks everybody for listening.